Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second in our webinar series, Improving Our Science and Increasing Our Impact. I am Kim Walski. I am the current president of Division 34 of the American Psychological Association, or as you may also know us, the Society for Environmental, Population, and Conservation Psychology. I am so excited to have Dr. Vanessa Hintz here with us today to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion in APA and applied psychology more broadly. This is a priority for us within Division 34 and something that we're really striving to do a better job of in all of our endeavors. Before I introduce Dr. Hintz, just let me give you a heads up about the format. You are welcome at any point to put questions in the Q&A box and I'll ask them on your behalf. And just be aware we are recording this and we'll post it on the Division 34 YouTube channel afterward. So without further delay, let me introduce Dr. Hintz. She is a licensed clinical psychologist and currently serves as the Senior Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Engagement and Outreach for the American Psychological Association. In her career, Dr. Hintz has worked in various clinical settings with children, adolescents, and adults with a wide array of presenting issues. And she is an active proponent of multicultural practice and theory and works dynamically to understand how individuals make meaning of the world within their various cultural contexts. She is also a self-proclaimed psych geek and incorporates elements of popular culture, which you can see behind her in her office, into her work when it's beneficial. And she has engaged with practitioners and scholars in the fields of academia, consultation, and training, utilizing expertise in psychology and human behavior to provide insights focused on principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So welcome and thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you. And hello, everyone. It's weird just seeing your names and not your faces, but I just imagine everyone looks fabulous. And I thank you all for welcoming me to this is my work from home chic. So thank you for welcoming me as I am. And I'm going to pull up the slides and we'll get started. I'm going to try to talk for about 30-ish minutes. So we have adequate time to have conversation afterwards. And so again, this is hopefully going to be more conversational and not as much talking at. And at any point, like Kim said, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Are in the Q&A box, excuse me. And then there will also be a mechanism that I'll share with you all. If you prefer to submit your questions anonymously, you're free to do so as well. So without further ado, let me just make sure I'm on like the right, too many screens. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our equity, diversity, and inclusion framework, the APA's EDI framework. And again, I want to talk to Kim's point more specifically about what that means for applied psychologists, what that means for you all in Division 34 and in the work that you do. And I will admit that this is a space of learning for me as well. I'm a clinical psychologist. I was trained as a clinician. I think like a clinician. And so thinking about psychology in applied or scientific ways is very foreign to me. And so I very much welcome and am appreciative of this space to have this conversation with you all. So this is kind of what we're going to do. I just always feel like obligated to say, like, these are our objectives. You know, we just go where the wind takes us. We'll see what happens. But these are definitely, when we think about our larger EDI strategy, some things that as an association, we are definitely trying to work towards. And I'm going to talk about each of these things more specifically as we get through the presentation. And then I'll also be sure that these slides are shared in addition to the video. These slides can be shared with you all as well. So you have all this information because it is a lot. It is dense at certain points. And so before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the Midwest. This is the occupied territory of Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and Potawatomi First Peoples, the first people of the land. I think it's important to acknowledge that. If you have any question about who were the first people that occupied your land or who settled your land, excuse me, you can send a text to this number, city and state in 2-letter form, and it'll send you a text right back and tell you all of the sort of first peoples that settled the land. I think it's important to acknowledge that, to sort of situate that. I think it's also important to acknowledge and situate the impossibility of separating the history of psychology in all of its forms from histories of colonialism and enslavement in the US. I also want to acknowledge that there are so many inequities that continue to persist today, which is why I have a job. I think also why we continue to advocate for EDI in the not only in the field of psychology, but in society at large. And so I also just am dramatically going to introduce myself because a lot of what we're going to talk about today is very personal. Like when we talk about issues of inclusion and identity and equity, these are things that are deeply personal to me and can be deeply personal to others as well. So I feel like in a way that's not creepy, it's important for people to understand me on sort of a personal level. And so again, I'm a psychologist, I'm a clinical psychologist. I went to a school in Chicago that had a very fairly large cohort, but I could probably count the people of color like maybe on two hands. And so the experience of going through graduate education as a person of color, I transplanted to the city of Chicago. I knew no one. When I came to graduate school, I came to that city, me, myself, and I, and didn't know anyone else. And so I say that because I think all of that is sort of, those were formative experiences for me, not only as a professional, but as a person. I'm a millennial. I just want to say that out loud because I know that we get blamed for stuff and we're overzealous and we eat too much avocado toast, like whatever. But I'm just gonna say I'm a millennial and we didn't do all that stuff that we get blamed for. It's not our fault we have debt. I'm also biracial. I'm a biracial Black woman. My mother is white and my father is Black. And I think I say that because it took me a long time to be able to say with any level of confidence that I'm a biracial Black woman. My mom is white, and to be able to say I'm a Black woman, it took me years. I mean, like within the last 3 years, I got to a place where I felt like I could say that and I felt like it was true. And I sort of credit that to my own, personal journey, but also the journey that I've taken professionally and really working to understand, dynamics of power and privilege and all of these different things, right? So I'm biracial. I'm also somebody's wife. My husband is a white man. And so I'm in an interracial marriage. And again, I think I would like to say that in 2022, that's not a big deal. It very much still is a big deal, particularly where we live. And he grew up in a town where there were not very many people of color. Again, he could tell me like there were 3 Black families and they lived here, you know what I'm saying? And so again, I think it definitely influences the way that we move through the world, like as a couple, as a family, but also just, myself. And then lastly, like Kim said, I'm like a huge nerd or a Black nerd. I love nerdy things. It's like part of my life. It's part of my identity, my professional identity for sure, but also personally as well. So that's me in a nutshell. And again, I don't like this language, but I like to model this sort of, again, these are spaces in which I find community and belonging in my identity. And that is so tied up with the work that I do. I think it's impossible to separate those things. So that's why I sort of introduce myself, not just in the professional way, but also, again, these are my communities. And then the last thing I'll say by way of introduction, maybe second to last thing I'll say by way of introduction is, again, in some of these conversations, particularly conversations rooted in EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, it can get very, very uncomfortable. And I welcome that. I'm a clinician, of course, I welcome that. But I want to borrow sort of these understandings from Glenn Singleton's work, Courageous Conversations About Race, which we're going to talk about other stuff too, but I think this is sort of a good generalizable way to contextualize the space. So staying engaged, whatever that looks like for you, it's like in the middle of a day, on a work day. And so however you engage is A-okay with me. Like how you need to engage is you take care of yourself the way that you need to. And again, I invite people to experience discomfort. Discomfort is a precursor for change. What I don't invite and what I don't condone is psychological harm. If you're in this space and you feel like what is being said or you're experiencing a sense of harm, that's not cool. And again, I invite you to take care of yourself as you need to. We're all sort of in our own place with regard to how we engage in these conversations. Speak truth. You are one of one. There's nobody on this earth whose truth is the same as yours. And I invite you to speak yours honestly and authentically in whatever way that is, whether it's divergent with mine or otherwise. And then lastly, expect and accept non-closure. we did not get to the place that we're in now overnight. And so we're not going to get to a place where EDI is fabulous and everyone is kumbayaing. Like, that's not going to happen overnight. That's not going to happen with one conversation. That's not going to happen within the division with one conversation. And so I think if we come into these conversations, these engagements, expecting we're not going to solve all the problems and we're likely going to leave with more questions than answers, I think we sort of reduce our feelings of frustration. So those are, again, just contextualizing things to think about. One last piece of contextualization. So EDI, DEI, JEDI, whatever we're talking about, right? There's like all these acronyms and all of these different things. And so I just want to contextualize these terms the way that the association does. So the way the APA defines these terms, and these definitions are taken directly from the EDI framework. And so I'll just very briefly say, you know, like when we talk about equity, we're talking about providing resources according to need. Equality is providing all the same resources to everyone, so everybody gets the same thing. Equity is not that. Equity is an ongoing process of assessing need and providing resources based on those needs. And so I think that for some people in spaces of EDI, that gets uncomfortable because we were taught, I mean, I don't want to say we, I was taught growing up that everybody should get the same thing. That's fair. But equity is not about fairness, it's about need. You know what I'm saying? And so that's our understanding of equity. Diversity is what is. So diversity is a composition of social identity groups. It's what is, you know what I'm saying? And I think that that's one thing that I'll say. And the second thing I'll say about diversity is we all are intersectional beings. You saw the way that I sort of introduced myself, like that was a whole mess. And that was my unique constellation of how I identify. And so what diversity looks like for me or for anybody or whatever, it's unique. You know what I'm saying? And so those are also things that we have to keep in mind. Diversity is about more than race. Diversity is about more than sexual orientation or gender diversity or whatever. You know what I'm saying? It's complex. And so I think our interventions have to be complex as well. And then lastly, inclusion. This is an action. Inclusion is an active process. Inclusion is a way of cultivating a space and environment where people feel safe, psychologically safe, to engage as their authentic selves. So I don't feel like I have to be anything other than what I want to be because this space is welcoming. And again, that is something that is active, and it's not something that you achieve and it's like, oh, our space is inclusive and now we're done. It's something that you sort of, it's a vigilance that you sort of have to maintain. And so again, contextualization just to ground us in the space. And now I definitely want to hear from you all. So that changed like really fast, but this is, I have a couple questions that I would welcome you all to answer. And so there's two ways that you can engage in this poll, which is absolutely 1000% anonymous. If you're fancy, you can scan that QR code. You can take a picture of that with your phone and it'll take you right to where we need to go. If you're less fancy, you can go to the website listed here, slido.com, slido.com. It's going to ask you for an event code, and you see that code listed there, which is 616-375. And I'll just give you a minute or so. This is a word cloud, so as people respond to this question, the responses will show up on the screen. Someone always does that. I love it. And words that appear larger are ones that appear more often. So I'll just zip and give us about a minute or so, and then we'll go on to question 2. And as these responses are coming in, as you're seeing, colleagues respond, I just invite you to take it in and, what reactions do you have? Do you feel a sense of validation from what you're seeing? Do you feel the opposite of that? Do you feel like, oh, I don't know what these people are talking about. I never thought of that. I just invite you to take that in. And we'll give it another minute or so. And then for sake of time, we'll just continue on. We have one more question, and then we'll get into talking about the framework. Ooh, that changed real quick. Okay, cool. Ooh, shout out to whoever said working through your own biases. Yes, 100% yes. we all always have work to do where that's concerned. Fabulous. And I believe you can respond as often as you want to. I'm pretty sure it allows you to do that. So this will remain open. I'm just going to go on to the second question just for sake of time, but please feel free to continue. Ooh, white supremacy culture. Yes. Whoever wrote that. Okay. Coming in hot. I like it. Okay. So I'm going to move on to question 2, but again, feel free to continue to add to this. And again, you can reference those responses at any time. So question 2, before we get into the conversation, maybe, is what do you hope to gain from our discussion today? So it's important for me to, again, this is a collaborative being with environment. I don't want to, I'm talking a lot, obviously, but I don't want it to be talking at or lecturing. And so I want to definitely also be able to talk to you all in a way that's beneficial. And so I'll give a minute too for people to respond there. Same here. This is a word cloud, and then we will, yes, continue learning, and then we will continue on. I love the spirit of learning here. I'm excited. Beautiful. Ooh, understanding APA's position toward past harm. Oh, I love it. I love it. You all are coming with it, and I'm excited. And I'll give it another couple seconds or so, and then we'll get into the conversation. Connecting ecological justice. Oh, yes. Oh my God. Yes. I'm like so excited. Okay. So I'm going to, again, this is open and feel free to continue to put your ideas in there. This is available. And I will invite you all also, whatever sort of mechanism you're using to access this poll. At the end of our discussion today, again, as I referenced, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions anonymously. If you prefer, it'll be through the same poll. So if you just keep that open, when we get to that point, you'll be able to put some questions in there if you don't feel comfortable asking them another way. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about EDI at APA, both those acronyms. EDI at APA, and this conversation is going to specifically focus on the EDI framework. There is a lot of other work that we're doing that I'll reference right now with regard to advancing racial equity. I'm not going to go into detail about that, one, because we don't have time, and two, because again, this conversation is sort of rooted in the framework. I will absolutely share resources with you all, and then, you know, share my email address as well. So if you want to have a conversation about any of that, we can definitely do so. So this is the EDI team. As you can see, there are 6 people. I just want to point that out. There's 6 people. We're a very small and mighty office led by Dr. Maisa Akbar, our Chief Diversity Officer. And so we do a lot of things with a small amount of people. And I'm going to talk a little bit about all the things that we do. So these are all the things that we do. So I think in a nutshell, without going into too much detail about all of these things, we are both we're basically largely responsible for architecting the EDI strategy. So again, the EDI office is very new. End of 2018, beginning of 2019 is when it was officially formed. And so we're basically trying to create something that doesn't exist, doesn't yet exist. We're not revising, we're literally manifesting, creating this EDI strategy, not only organizationally for APA, like central office, but you think about APA as a membership organization with 130,000 plus members, right? So we're thinking about the EDI strategy across all of these different sort of environments. And so that is a lot, particularly given that, again, we have a blank canvas, which is both a gift and a curse. I think it's a gift because we can sort of do what we want. It's a curse because it takes a lot. It takes a lot to sort of create something where nothing exists. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of like the meticulousness that we're engaging in this work, because we don't just want to build something and put something on paper to say that we did it, because I definitely think that has been a way of doing things in the past that has not been so beneficial for APA. So thinking about the sort of paths that the path that brought us here. So again, we're really trying now to be intentional about the work that we're doing. And, you know, going all the way back to, the 60s, I wasn't there, but in the 60s, right, there was a group of Black psychologists that left APA because they didn't feel included because of the toxicity of the environment. As such, the Association of Black Psychologists was formed. And so we know that, as near back as then, APA was like, we had some stuff going on, you know what I'm saying? And so, since that time, since that sort of split and the formation of AB Science, since then, there have been other organizations that have sort of been offshoots of APA. There has been a sort of renewed interest in like trying to figure out what is going on or why is this happening? What can we do? And I would be remiss if I didn't say that I think, the events of 2020, not just COVID, but also, the sort of the renewed racial reckoning that occurred, I think influence is and continues to influence the work that we do. So more recently, though, like as I mentioned at the end of 2018, Dr. Evans sort of commissioned the EDI Office, the Chief Diversity Officer, and for the development of the EDI Framework, which we're going to talk about today. And so we have basically all that we do with regard to EDI strategy is rooted in that framework. And so, again, we are also not trying to go in blindly to all of these things, like, oh, let's just go in here and start doing some stuff. I think we need to acknowledge where we messed up at and sort of what hasn't worked in the past. What is the issue? What are the issues that we're trying to address? And how can we do so in a way that is coordinated and in a way that we can assess impact? Because again, how EDI has functioned within the association has been a whole lot. And I'm going to show you right now just graphically, so just prepare your eyes. So the EDI Executive Office right now is sort of like the we're sort of like the EDI hub for the association. And across the association, there are all these different directorates, all of these different offices that are doing EDI work. And you can see some of them here. We have public interest, who are sort of outward facing with regard to their EDI work, advocacy, education, science, practice, and all of these other things. You know what I'm saying? So before that sort of centralized hub of the EDI office, this was all still going on, but just all over everywhere. And again, that is not to negate the value or the impact of any of this. I think that what we have found, though, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is that we were maybe not being as effective as we could or should be. And so again, all of this just makes my eyes hurt. But again, I just also want to remind everybody that at the center of this circle are 6 people, just so you know, just remember that. So if you need to write a letter to someone and say that we need more people, I'd be okay with it. But again, our goal is to try to coordinate these efforts because all of them are fabulous in their own right. And I think, could bolster the impact of these initiatives if we had a coordinated strategy. And so what should that strategy be? And this is where we're going to get into talking more specifically about the EDI framework. So again, and somebody referenced this in the poll, right? Taking a very authentic and honest accounting of APA's contributions to inequity. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that looked like with the racism related work that we're doing, the racial equity work. But before we do anything, we need to acknowledge, again, where have we caused harm? Because psychology, the field of psychology in the United States, the association APA, there has been harm that has been done. And so before we fix anything, I think we have to acknowledge where we've come from. We also have to uplift the voices of people who have been harmed and people who have been historically marginalized, historically excluded. I was talking with a group yesterday and thinking about all of the psychologists I learned about in the history of psychology in that course. They all look the same. Pretty much all of them look the same. Why is that? You know what I'm saying? Why is their science and their research more valuable than others? And then actively championing EDI. So both Dr. Evans, our CEO, and Dr. Akbar really believe, as do I, that psychology has something very unique to offer all spaces with regard to EDI. So not just ours, but EDI more generally. Psychology as a discipline, excuse me, has a lot to offer. And so that is some of the work that we're doing as well. What does psychology and psychological science have to offer the larger society with regard to championing EDI values? And so, again, talking about the EDI framework, it is awesome. It's available to everyone. You could read it right now if you wanted to. It was sort of released, for lack of a better word, in March of last year, March of 2021. So this is our foundation. This is the association's position, the positional statement on EDI. So when we talk about like, what does that even mean? What are you even trying to do? It's all in this document. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we build off of this document, but basically I'm going to go through this framework and sort of identify some of the pertinent pieces. So one is, again, the vision for the association, and accessible, equitable, and inclusive psychology. Those are EDI principles inherent in the vision of the association. And our mission, again, is to advance EDI through psych science. So again, psychology and psychological science has something very unique to offer the entire world with regard to promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion. And it's our job as the EDI office to really figure out how do we best do that while also keeping our own house in order. So this is the EDI framework. And I'm going to basically go through it as it's easier for me to do it in sort of graphical visual representation. And I'm going to start in the middle. So you see in the middle, these sort of concentric circles, these various ecological levels. We see leadership and infrastructure, APA, field of psychology and society. So really leadership and infrastructure and APA, that's like really one circle. So there's three levels that we talk about with regard to EDI work. Are we trying to impact and influence APA? And that's APA as an organization, a membership organization, so divisions, state associations, governance, APA staff. So are we trying to intervene and influence there? Are we trying to influence the broader field of psychology? Or are we trying to influence society as a whole? And those things are often cross-cutting. And we often challenge ourselves to really be specific about the work that we're doing. So we are really focused right now on APA, because again, before we tell anyone what they need to be doing, we need to get ourselves together. And so again, when you think about, and I think I also sort of challenge people who are hoping to engage in this type of work in their own organizations or even divisionally, thinking really inviting yourself to think about, what am I trying to do? Because again, I think so often with EDI work, the feeling is there and we just want to do all the things all the time. And that leads to a narrower or sort of like a not as much impact because we weren't as specific about what we were doing. So those are sort of like those circles on the inside. Are we trying to influence APA, the field of psychology, or society? Now, those light blue sort of labels that you see on the outside, practice, education, advocacy, and science, those are typically the way that the association outlines different domains of psychology. So people who are psychologists, people who do psychology, usually do it in one of these ways. So they practice, they educate, they engage in research and science and applied stuff, or they do advocacy, or they do all of those things, because we wear many hats. Before I came to APA, I wore 3 of these hats. And so, but again, when we're thinking about our EDI efforts, we're thinking about them again in these different domains, because what EDI looks like in psychological practice for me as a clinician may be very different and often is very different than what it looks like for an applied psychologist or a researcher or a scientist or someone who's advocating or someone who works for a corporation. It looks very different, and I think we have to acknowledge that. And then lastly, this sort of outermost layer, these labels that you see, access and equity, cultural and emotional intelligence, psychological safety, and inclusive policies and practices. Those are sort of like our broad domains of EDI work. So when we say like, okay, we want to, for example, we want one of our primary priority areas for our racial equity work is diversifying pathways to become a psychologist, because the psychology workforce is 84% white and 16% people of color. And so that is a lot, you know what I'm saying? And not representative of like even US Census data. And so how can we diversify those pathways? And I think we can think about that from all of these different domains of EDI work. So access and equity, we know that people of color and other marginalized folks don't have the same access to higher education as do their white counterparts or people from other privileged backgrounds. So we can think about diversifying pathways from an access and equity issue. We can think about it from a cultural and emotional intelligence issue, in that, again, I talked about my own experience in graduate school. It's not always kind, because the professors that are teaching me don't have that level of emotional intelligence to know that you can't ask me to speak for all Black people because I'm the only Black person in this class. So there are ways that we can, think about our priorities regarding EDI work and then sort of break them down into these different domains. So that's the EDI framework in a nutshell, so to speak. And again, it took me like 14 times doing this presentation before I could say that, like, okay, I get it. Because again, I think there's a lot of moving parts. And again, I think, understanding it as, as a framework and a way to really conceptualize the work that we're doing is also helpful. What it is not, which is what we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes, is like any sort of operational plan. It's not that. It's just sort of a way to conceptualize. And we're going to talk about how we're going to get to that operational plan in a second. I'm going to move forward because I sort of already talked about those different levels and areas of influence, APA, field, and society. So these are just some examples of principles articulated within the framework at that field of psychology level. So what are some EDI principles that the association is striving for? Decolonizing psychological science. So again, there is a very specific type of research. There's a very specific type of science that is valued and others are undervalued. So what is a way that we can change that? Why is qualitative research any less valuable? Why is research that is rooted in metaphysics or, different ways of thinking about spirituality, why is that any less valuable than objective research? You know what I'm saying? So these are things that we're working to, again, decolonizing the science, incorporating like pedagogy about racism and health, like everything that I know about racial equity and racism and dynamics of power and privilege, I learned after graduate school. Everything that I know. And I would call myself an expert, but all of that I did after graduate school. And that's a shame. That's a shame. And then again, sort of dismantling institutional inequities, not just racism, but institutional inequities across the board. So when we think about, again, the EDI framework, what are some things these are the types of things that are listed in there with regard to guiding principles, sort of like what are our North Stars, so to speak. These are some examples of some principles that are articulated at the societal level. So again, we have the APA level, field, and society. And so thinking about what are we working towards at those different levels? As a science, as a discipline, as an association, what are we trying to do? And so the last thing I'll say before we sort of move into talking about specifically about the work that you all do is another foundational document that we have are the inclusive language guidelines. And these came out at the end of 2021. I think it was December, like the beginning of December 2021. And basically these are, again, a resource, not a mandate, not a you better do this or else. More so it provides guidance on inclusive and appropriate language, both written and in conversation. And so an example that I'll give is that you heard me just a few moments ago talk about pathways to becoming a psychologist. Very recently, and still a lot of people refer to that as the pipeline. And that word can be offensive to our First Nations colleagues, to the first peoples of this land, using the term pipeline. And so again, that's something that in the inclusive language guidelines, it provides, that sort of guidance. It's not a mandate. People can say what they want, but more so provides sort of concentrated information about more inclusive ways of speaking and being. And again, as soon as we put this out, it was outdated. Because that's how it goes. You know what I'm saying? And so again, I think we don't, all of the work that we're doing is iterative. And this is sort of what that iteration looks like. So what we're doing now in the association, we have outlined these foundational understandings with the EDI framework. we've outlined, okay, this is our foundation. Like all the work that we're doing is based on this. Similarly, in the work that we're doing right now with regard to racial equity, we had to outline our foundational understandings of race and racism. So in February of 2021, there was a council resolution passed that defined racism. So when we talk about racism as APA, what are we talking about? We're talking about these different levels. We're talking about intersectionality. We're talking about all this stuff. Then in October of last year, there was a trio of racism resolutions that passed through council. One was the apology to people of color for APA's failure to challenge racism. The second was a resolution, psychology's role in dismantling systemic racism. So again, what do we have to uniquely offer to dismantle these systems? And then the last was health equity, the health equity resolution, which really centered racism as one of the primary drivers of health inequity. And so again, all of that was step one here. All of that was outlining a foundational understanding. So what is our foundational understanding of EDI? And very specifically to the work we're doing now, what are our foundational understandings of racial equity, and what are we trying to do? Like what are we trying to do? How do we advance racial equity as an association? And so step two in this sort of like this operationalizing path is to establish a baseline. So where are we now? And we just did that with regard to the racial equity work and completing the audit. That again, I can share these links with you all, but the audit really established the baseline for the association's efforts specifically related to racial equity. So what are we doing? Like people say they're doing a whole bunch of stuff. What are we actually doing? Like let's take an accounting. And now this sort of third step, which is where we are now, which is like a whole situation, is figuring out, okay, we know where we want to go. We have these aspirational documents, the resolutions, the framework. We know where we are. Now, how do we get from point A to point B? Which sounds so simple, and it's really not. It's like a whole situation. But I share all this to say that I think that this is something different with regard to EDI work that the association had not done in the past. And, I'm biased, but I think that we are ahead of the game with regard to some other sort of like industries. You know what I'm saying? In the type of work that we're trying to do in this sort of coordinated effort that we're doing with regard to establishing these foundational understandings, figuring out where we are and how do we get to where we need to go. And so in the work that you all are doing, whether it be in the division or otherwise, engaging in sort of this EDI work, it is like, this is a lot. And I would say before I came into this space, I was a consultant, and I would just come to organizations and be like, yo, this is what we need to do. And it was very different than working in this type of systems way. And so I think that there are good things and bad things about being in a system. This is something that I value with regard to sort of like creating this sort of, again, this iterative process, this thread. We always talk about EDI as a thread that needs to permeate the entire organization, the entire whatever. I think this is how you do that. This is how you make that happen. And so I'll just close with this because I'm talking over my time, but I'll just close with this and talking more specifically about the work that you all do. So thank you to Kim for sharing this information with me, because again, this is a space for learning for me. I'm like, what? Applied psychology? I don't know what that is. And so this was very helpful for me. So this is information from the mission statement of the division. And then over here to the right in this little diagram, you see different things, again, that Kim shared with me. You think about the work that you all are engaged in. And as I was looking at this, and I see everything through a racial equity lens, because that's just my lane. That's like how I work. That's where, like that's my space. And so as I was thinking about this and looking at this, I was like, okay, human interaction with natural landscapes, built environments, and interior spaces. And I just automatically started thinking about redlining and how, people of color are in, dilapidated spaces. And I just started thinking about all these intersectional pieces, right? I was like, dang, you know what I'm saying? Thinking about how and why that's an EDI issue, and how and why there are certain, you think about natural landscapes, like I want to live next to a lake, but I know I'm never going to be able to afford that, right? Like I know how much that would just make my soul smile. I know I'm never going to be able to afford that. And so you think about all the dynamics of socioeconomic status and how that intersects with issues of race and all of these different things. And so how that then has an influence on where people even live. You know what I'm saying? And how that affects the way that they interact with that space. This is how I feel like we bring EDI into the work that you all do. Thinking about climate change and environmental justice. The fact that so many, we went on a tour when I was in college of, I went to the college at the University of Louisville in Louisville, Kentucky. And we went on, I was in this like environmental science class, and we went on a trip to all the hot spots throughout the city, of where like, this is a rubber factory and this is here. And these are like really bad environmental spaces. And I just remember looking around and seeing the people who live in those neighborhoods. You know what I'm saying? That literally have no choice but to live in those neighborhoods. And if that's not an environmental injustice, you know what I'm saying? That again, to me is an EDI issue. Everything is an EDI issue to me, but you know what I'm saying? Thinking about population size, growth, and distribution. What did COVID just teach us about people who live in spaces where there are a lot of people in a small space? You know what I'm saying? COVID has disproportionately affected people of color, partly because of that. I have to live in a space, like I have to live with 10 people in this house because that's all I can do. You know what I'm saying? And then the relationships between well-being and the natural environment. I know that I was like yesterday years old when I really started to understand the value of being outside. When I was younger, partly because I grew up in the desert, so we were just not going outside. It was like way too hot. But I think that like my family, that was never like, oh, we need to go outside and take a hike or we need to do this. It just wasn't a value. It just wasn't a value. And I think that there's some of that is cultural. I think there's some of that again, like when my mom had to work all these jobs to support all of her kids, she wasn't home telling us we need to go for a hike outside. She was working all these jobs to support these kids. And so again, I think that these, again, to me, are EDI issues. And sort of the last thing that I keep saying is the last thing, but this is for real the last thing that I'm going to say before we open it up to questions. This is another thing that I took from the mission statement that, again, I sort of highlighted these pieces that I was like, yes. And again, you talk about developing connections, exchanging information, relational dynamics. That is EDI 101. How can we be with other people in a way, again, that they feel like I can authentically show up to exchange this information with you. I don't feel like I can only be in a space with you when this other person is there to protect me or like whatever, you know what I'm saying? So even I love this. When I was putting this together, I was like, yes, you know what I'm saying? These relational conversations, we're having a parallel process at APA right now. Everything that we do cannot be focused on a product. Everything that we do cannot be focused on an outcome. Relationship building is an outcome. Relationship building, being in the present moment, being with somebody is absolutely an EDI issue, and it's absolutely the undercurrent of everything we do. You talk about psychological safety, cultural and emotional intelligence, all of those domains that I talked about, those are rooted in relationships. EDI is rooted in relationships and valuing other people. And so, again, I think that the work that you all are doing, and again, what is inherent in the mission statement of the division, all of this to me, and again, when I say EDI issue, I don't want to make it sound like it's a problem to be solved. I just think that there are sort of parallels between what I've been talking about, and again, the work that you all do. And so this is really the last thing that I'm gonna leave you with, and then we're gonna open it up to questions. But this is a video, it's like an APA hype video. So some of it, I'm just naturally cynical. I'm like, okay. But I do actually like this video. And it really talks about, again, our unique positioning as psychologists and the impact that we as psychologists and psychology can have on the world, particularly given all the shenanigans that are going on right now. So I think this is like 4 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and we'll have some time to engage in dialogue. So this is for real the last thing, and then we'll have conversation. Sorry, it's like it's the first time I'm doing this. Like I feel so embarrassed.
It's okay.
Everybody can see this now.
Crisis, stunning inequities, and constant change. In a world in the throes of a global pandemic where time seems to stand still, APA has remained relentless in its forward push to elevate psychology and improve lives. Under the leadership of APA 2021 President Dr. Jennifer F. Kelly and guided by its strategic plan, APA has stepped up its innovation, its influence, and its impact. And people are noticing. Policymakers value psychology. More and more, policymakers on Capitol Hill are recognizing the value of our science and our expertise, reaching out to APA to offer strategic guidance and informed legislation and action, inviting psychologists to offer strategic guidance, inviting APA to educate them on the psychological science, and inviting and accepting APA's recommendations on key issues. Decision makers and influencers value psychology. APA is at the table to help partners understand and apply the science so larger audiences benefit. We worked with Sesame Street to ensure their programming is grounded in research in mental health and anti-bias strategies, and with Viacom CBS to support their development of storylines that accurately and responsibly portray the human experience. And business leaders value psychology. APA is working with multiple partners in the business community on how COVID-19, the rise of telework, and technology are transforming jobs and the impact these changes will have on the nature of work, organizational performance, and worker well-being, like a national effort across 44 cities on mental health and the workplace, and a VIP conversation with 200 Fortune 500 CEOs and executives on the science of a healthy workplace. APA prioritizes quality in education, in science and research, and in care. Supported by funding from the CDC, APA develops science-based resources to support pre-K through 12 teachers in addressing student emotional and mental health challenges exacerbated by the pandemic, foster resilience, improve learning outcomes in virtual and in-person environments, and encourage safe public health behaviors in and out of the classroom. APA is keeping the pressure on to support our clinicians, spearheading a record-breaking 9,814 comments by psychologists to CMS, and preventing a proposed 10% Medicare reimbursement cut for 2021. APA is leading the field in supporting quality research and the next generation of scientists through our innovative PsychLearn program, which immerses students in a personalized science-based learning experience that enriches undergraduate psychology instruction. Through APA Style, we are ensuring that psychology functions as a hub of interdisciplinary collaboration. And APA journals continue to set the standard and deliver research that the field can use. Research published in APA journals remains the most highly cited content in psychology. The impact factor of APA's flagship journal, American Psychologist, has increased by 67% to well over 10. And APA is everywhere. APA members, APA journals, and APA spokespeople were in the media more than 23,000 times so far in 2021. Over the past 4 years, media coverage has increased 600%. APA's Monitor magazine and Speaking of Psychology podcast together took home 5 awards, including 2 coveted golds in the prestigious Association's Media and Publishing Network's Excel Awards. And for the 4th consecutive year, APA's overall membership has grown during a time when many associations are seeing declines. We are far from done. This year, APA has laid the groundwork for what comes next. We are preparing the field for the future, working together to craft a shared vision for the future of education and practice. Collaborating with the CDC to secure a $2 million grant to promote desperately needed scientific research on misinformation and vaccine decision-making, and helping state leaders learn population health strategies that promote the health of all, not only those with a behavioral health diagnosis. Importantly, APA is taking a stand not only against the horrors that inequity brings, but against racism and hatred in all its forms. From standing with other powerful organizations to promote equitable vaccine distribution and access, to educating the public about how inequality harms our society and ways to dismantle systemic and institutional racism, to elevating the role of psychology and advancing health equity to a global audience. APA is collectively crafting a path forward, where psychology marshals its collective expertise in the fight of our lifetime, where APA looks inward at itself and our field, and acknowledges the harm we have caused, and where together we move forward to make it right, to make it better.
With that, I'm going to stop the screen share and again, open it up in the last few minutes we have. I promised I wasn't going to talk that long. I'm sorry. I talked for so long. What questions do you have at all? Any questions? And I will also remind everyone that if you want to submit your question anonymously, I'll open that up in the poll that we just did. So you're free to do that as well, and that'll come to me. And I'll be able to read that. So questions that anybody has.
I'll give people a moment to formulate a question, but I might come up with one in the meantime.
Okay.
Something that really struck me throughout your presentation is this idea of there's a vigilance that's required. It's not like you just do EDI and it's done. It requires active engagement. And you also mentioned how 2020 was sort of this galvanizing moment of renewed racial reckoning. And that was certainly true in my lived experience in terms of my university and what was going on here. And it was a really empowering time of feeling like there's momentum. But it was also momentum that sort of died down at some point. I mean, I think in this weird way, we benefited from the pandemic of people could really focus their attention and act on their values. Do you have suggestions, or have you seen practices that organizations have used to help sustain attention to EDI so that it is something that is an ongoing consideration in the work we're doing? To keep it at the forefront?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I would say that, again, something that's different about APA versus what I did in the past is, again, that foundation. So we're baking this into the work that we do. It's not like we have a task force that's going to do a thing and then they're going to go away. I mean, we do have task forces, but I think that from an organizational perspective, having the EDI framework and now working to develop this plan, how do we, again, bake this in so that even when people are tired, it's like, well, we still got to do that thing. We got to pay taxes all the time. I'm sick of paying taxes, but that's because it's woven into what we do, every aspect of what we do. And I think with EDI, it's similar. So I think usually the first thing, again, is to sort of like orient and ground yourself, your organization, whatever have you. I think this can be an individual thing or organizationally, but grounding yourself and your understandings of EDI principles, of values, all of that. And then everything else sort of comes from that. It's like, okay, now we have these values. Now I personally know what my values are. What do I want to do with this? What are my goals? What am I trying to do? Do I just want to learn or whatever? And so I think organizationally speaking, there has to be simultaneous like policy change and also hearts and minds change. You know what I'm saying? I think one is insufficient without the other.
Thank you for that. We are getting some questions. So in the chat, you mentioned the need to not just develop goals and objectives, but also metrics and accountability structures. What are some of the metrics that you have helped to craft and apply at APA?
It's so funny that you say that, because we literally were in a conversation about that earlier, because like APA, they're like, we need to do this thing and we need it tomorrow. And it's like, hold up, because again, these metrics, that's someone's whole thesis. That's a whole dissertation process. And so right now we're in the first step of that. So goals and objectives, we're trying to build those in a very intentional way and get buy-in from all the people like the board, whoever needs to say like, yeah, let's do it. And then we can work with our strategy team to develop these metrics. Because again, you think about some of the things that we're working toward, like an increase in psychological safety. What does that even mean? Like, how do you even measure that? And I will admit that is above me. I'm an existentialist. I am a qualitative researcher. I'm like, I don't know. So that's a great question. And that's something that we are sort of in the thick of right now with this racial equity action plan. Like, these things are so great. How do we measure them? And so we're sort of working with the strategy team and our experts out in the field to try to help us figure this out. But I will definitely be so happy to pass that information along when we have it, because it's a lot.
Yeah, I think it's something a lot of organizations are struggling with. Someone else commented that their university has an EDI component for all faculty that they have to incorporate and they're actively evaluated on, which the active evaluation part is really great. And I think something we don't see enough of. There is a question on what's your perspective on the Association of Black Psychology's rejection of APA's apology?
I will say first, let me take off my APA hat. I'm just speaking as an individual, not as a representative. I will say that it's a both and for me. One, I want everyone to take APA to task about what we're doing. And so I don't want this sort of blind, like, this is so great. Like, no, you know what I'm saying? If people have an issue, take issue with anything that has been said, please shout it from the rooftops. Because again, I think that we definitely need those reality checks, for lack of a better word. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is, ABPSI was involved to the extent that they accepted the invitation to be involved in the apology development process. And I think there came a point where there was just like, we agree to disagree. And, ABPSI said, I don't think y'all should do that. And APA said, well, we're going to do it. And APA sort of had the blessing of the other ethnic psychological association. So I think a decision was made, like, we're going to move forward with this because we think it's time. And so part of that, it just makes me sad as a Black person. Like, I'm also a member of ABPSI, a lifetime member. And it just makes me sad that there's so much harm that it makes me sad that we have yet to rectify the harm. I understand why there's harm, and I understand that it takes more than them words that were on that paper to rectify it. So it's a both and for me. I'm sad because I just, like, I don't want it to be this way, and I understand why it's this way. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think we have like 1 minute left. So to try to end it on an upbeat note of, if you have one piece of advice for those of us who are trying to become more emotionally intelligent and to be aware and strive towards these goals, like, what do you recommend that we should be doing as a step in the right direction?
I hate to sound like a clinician, but I can't help it. But I just always invite people to lean into whatever they're feeling about any of this. So if you think it's absurd, if you love it, if it makes you feel bad, lean into that and really investigate that for yourself in whatever way that looks. Because until that is sort of solidified within yourself, anything you do is going to feel like haphazard. It's like, what is happening? And so at all points, if you can really just do that internal work and really lean into the way that you feel, because EDI is about how you are, it's not about what you do. So I think that requires that introspection.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for your time and just the energy that you brought to this. And I love that you took the time to really look at Division 34's mission as well. We so appreciate that. So thank you. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with you, as part of Division 34 into the future as well.
Yes. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.